So now that the tile is clean and ready, I'm going to go ahead and put some layers of underglaze on it. This is a Velvet Underglaze V360 white. And so I'm using it in a small container because it's easier to get to with the brush than the bigger container. And I'm just going to stir it up and get the brush loaded up with enough underglaze to get a nice layer. And I'm going to do 4 layers on this tile. Since we're applying the underglaze to greenware, it's going to absorb it less than if we were putting it onto very dry clay or bisque clay that's already been fired once. And this is because there's a lot of water still in the clay. Not only has it not been fired, but it's also still fairly wet, a little bit flexible. And so instead of absorbing into the surface like it would on a bisqued surface, it's going to be sort of like pushing around the underglaze a lot because it doesn't absorb very quickly. So I'm going to do about 4 coats on here and let them dry fully in between so that I can get a nice thick coat with each layer. And so I'm taking the brush and I'm trying to push the underglaze out to the edges without flowing over the edges. If you do spill out that way, it's pretty easy to clean it up with your fingernail or a tool, but I'm just trying not to do that with my application. And if you're using a brush that sheds bristles, an easy way to get those out of the surface is to take the tip of your scalpel or a needle tool and just lift that hair out of there and then fill up that spot that got poked with a little bit more underglaze. And it's nice to do this while it's still wet. It's easier to repair. And my brush is leaving behind ridges, so I'm just going over and over and over until that layer is just as even as possible. And this is trickiest on the first coat just because it's right against the bare clay. Once we get that sort of primer coat down, it's easier to disperse. Once I'm happy with that coat, I'm just going to let it dry completely before I apply the next layer. And this is sped up, but it only takes a few minutes to fully dry, and you'll be able to tell just because the gloss goes away and you can see some of the dark clay showing through more when it's completely dry. And when it's ready for the second coat, I'm going to rotate the board just because I like to work left to right, top to bottom, and so that sometimes leaves kind of predictable thick and thin spots. The top left will be really thick and the bottom right needs a little attention. So if I rotate it every time, that will help even out that mark making. I also just added a few drops of water to the underglaze. It was a little too thick and was going on in a way that I didn't like, so just added a few drops. You don't need much, and I'm just going to completely stir it up and then apply the same way. You can see that it's flowing on more easily when it's on top of that first layer. So I'm going to go ahead and rotate again for this third layer. You'll notice that in between coats, when the underglaze dries, the ridges that are super visible when it's wet are disappearing, especially with each consecutive coat. So I'm going to add a third one. Same technique, sort of gets easier and easier for that underglaze to flow across that surface as it gets more and more sealed. And actually with this third coat, there's some extra that's building up on the surface that I don't really need. So I'm going to just squeeze it off the edge of this cup as it builds up on the brush. And one more rotation for this final coat. So that's looking very nice and opaque. And that's all I'm going to do for the underglaze, and we'll move on to transferring the image and carving the design.